You've heard of Cleopatra, the woman who enchanted Rome and paid for it with her life. But you probably haven't heard of Zenobia, the queen who looked at Rome, the biggest empire on earth, and basically said, "Cute empire, I'll take it." In the middle of a collapsing world, she built her own. A desert kingdom that rose faster than Rome could say tribute tax. And when the Romans tried to put her back in her place, well, she rode into war on a camel wearing gold armor and nearly broke the empire in half. Picture this. It's the 3rd century CE, and Rome, once the swaggering rock star of civilization, is now more like a washed-up band that keeps replacing its lead singer. The empire that once built roads straighter than a geometry teacher's dream is now tripping over its own sandals. Emperors are dropping faster than fruit flies at a winery. Every other week, someone new is sitting on the imperial throne, trying to look confident while clutching a dagger behind their back, just in case their friend from the Senate walks in with another promotion opportunity. Inflation, through the roof. The Roman denarius, once a proud silver coin, is now basically a metal suggestion. Soldiers who used to be paid in gold are now getting paid in promises and IOUs written on papyrus that smells suspiciously like desperation. Entire legions are defecting to the highest bidder, which often means they're switching sides mid-battle. Imagine your army turning around and saying, "Actually, we like the other guy's dental plan." Meanwhile, the borders are cracking. Goths, Vandals, and Persians are all testing their luck. It's like a Black Friday sale, but everyone's armed. Provinces revolt, cities burn, emperors panic, and through it all, Rome insists everything's fine. Totally fine. Don't mind the fires or the missing treasury. Rome's still the eternal city. Sure, eternally broke, eternally paranoid, and eternally stabbing itself in the back. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, out beyond the empire's crumbling eastern edge, there's a city that looks like someone took all the best parts of Rome, Greece, and Persia, then added better lighting. Palmyra, a glittering oasis sitting right between the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. If Rome is an old emperor with gout and a drinking problem, Palmyra is the young influencer empire that just started going viral. Picture it. Long trade caravans moving through the desert, camels decked in colorful silks, merchants with rings heavier than their morals, spices so strong they could probably start wars, and sometimes did. Palmyra was rich, powerful, and perfectly positioned to profit off everyone else's drama. Silk from China, jewels from India, ivory from Africa, all passed through its markets. The city was a cultural smoothie, Greek temples, Roman baths, and Persian palaces all crammed together like history's most expensive Airbnb. At the top of this desert dream stood King Odenathus, a warlord turned royal who somehow convinced Rome to let him protect their eastern provinces. Translation: he protected them from Persia while quietly building his own mini-empire. Smart move. But beside him, often overshadowed by the chronicles written by men who couldn't stand sharing the spotlight, was his wife, Zenobia. Now, if history were fair, spoiler, it's not. Zenobia's name would have been carved on every pillar between Damascus and Rome. She wasn't just some royal accessory in fancy linen. She was educated, multilingual, strategic, and terrifyingly composed. Fluent in Greek, Latin, Egyptian, and Aramaic, which basically meant she could charm you, outwit you, and order your execution in 4 languages before breakfast. Zenobia wasn't born into a pampered palace life, either. She came from a noble Arab family, old money by desert standards, but she rose because she was brilliant, not because someone handed her a tiara. Imagine a woman in a world ruled by sweaty men in togas, all pretending to be gods, deciding she could do it better. And spoiler, she could. While Rome was spiraling into chaos, Zenobia's Palmyra was the definition of quiet luxury. Marble courtyards, fountains shimmering under desert stars, scholars reciting poetry under olive trees. And at the center of it all, Zenobia, the queen who could debate philosophy one moment and inspect cavalry drills the next. Think Cleopatra meets Daenerys Targaryen, but without the dragons or the toxic relationships. Palmyra's power didn't just come from trade, came from pride. This was a city that refused to kneel. Even under Rome's protection, it acted more like a partner than a subject. Palmyra provided stability when Rome couldn't. Odenathus led armies against the Persians when Rome was too busy fighting its own civil wars. He was their hero and Zenobia his equal. But here's the thing about Rome. It doesn't share well, especially when someone else starts doing empire better than it does. Imagine watching your neighbor's garden bloom while your own is on fire. That was Rome, staring east, pretending not to notice how Palmyra was becoming indispensable. The empire needed them for trade, for defense, for stability, but couldn't stand the idea of needing anyone. Let that sink in. A fading superpower, held together by ego and duct tape, leaning on a desert city run by a woman who hadn't even been crowned yet. You can almost feel history tightening its grip, the setup to an empire-sized meltdown. The irony? Rome's arrogance is exactly what gave Zenobia her opportunity. When the empire started eating itself alive, Palmyra stayed steady. Its roads were safe, its soldiers loyal, its taxes fairer than anything Rome ever managed. Merchants whispered that Palmyra, not Rome, was the real capital of the East. And in the heart of its golden streets, Zenobia was listening, watching, waiting. It's easy to romanticize this. The calm before the storm, the clever queen in the shadows, the empire too blind to see what's coming. But make no mistake, this wasn't a fairy tale. The desert doesn't care about destiny. It rewards those who survive. And Zenobia, she didn't just survive. She adapted. She watched as emperors in Rome were assassinated, usurped, or conveniently poisoned. She watched provinces revolt, generals defect, and legions vanish into oblivion. Every time Rome stumbled, Palmyra grew stronger, quietly, methodically. It was the classic story of the side character waiting for their moment to steal the movie. And oh, she was patient. You can almost imagine her standing on the palace balcony at night, staring west toward Rome's horizon. Maybe she smiled. Maybe she whispered something like, "You've had your turn." Of course, nobody could say that out loud, not yet. For now, Palmyra still played the loyal ally. Tribute was sent, letters exchanged, all the usual political foreplay. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Rome was unraveling, and in the silence between collapsing empires, Zenobia's legend began to hum. It's funny, history tends to forget the moments before greatness, the quiet years, the simmer before the boil. Everyone remembers the wars, the speeches, the golden armor. But it all started here, in the fading light of a dying empire, with one city refusing to crumble and one woman refusing to wait her turn. So next time you hear that tired line, Rome wasn't built in a day, remember this. It didn't fall in one either. It took centuries of pride, corruption, and denial to turn an empire into a warning. And while Rome was busy forgetting how to empire, Zenobia was busy learning how to replace it. If history were a movie, Zenobia wouldn't enter with a gentle flute melody or a polite "Your Majesty." She'd kick open the doors of the 3rd century wearing gold armor, perfectly unbothered, while some terrified Roman bureaucrat fumbles his scrolls and whispers, "She's not supposed to be here." See, the Romans loved categories. Men conquered, women embroidered. But Zenobia didn't read the script. She rewrote it in 3 languages before breakfast. Greek for philosophy, Latin for politics, and Egyptian for pure drama. And she wasn't just multilingual, she was multidimensional. A queen, a scholar, a strategist, and, allegedly, a descendant of Cleopatra herself. You know, the Cleopatra, the one Rome couldn't stop obsessing over like an ex they swore they were over, but still built documentaries about centuries later. But Zenobia wasn't Cleopatra. She wasn't flirting with power. She was power. Cleopatra seduced Rome. Zenobia challenged it. And that, my friends, is a dangerous difference. Let's rewind. Before she became a queen, Zenobia grew up surrounded by wealth, but not weakness. Her family was noble, yes, but this was the desert. You couldn't buy survival with money. You needed wit, endurance, and a level of patience that could outlast the sun. Palmyra wasn't an empire of marble and slaves. It was an empire of trade and grit. Every breath of wind carried stories from distant lands. caravans from India, Persia. She read philosophers, memorized battle tactics, and allegedly, this is my favorite detail, refused wine because she preferred clarity. Imagine that. A woman surrounded by generals who thought drunken confidence equaled genius. And she's there, sipping water, planning kingdoms. Then came Odenathus, her husband, her equal, her king. A man powerful enough to fend off Persia, clever enough to ally with Rome, and humble enough to know his wife might be smarter. Together, they ruled Palmyra not just as monarchs, but as architects of a vision. A stable, cultured, glittering hub in a collapsing world. The empire was a mess, but their city, thriving. And then, because history loves drama, Odenathus was assassinated. Mysteriously, nobody ever found out who did it. Some say it was political rivals. Others say it was a jealous family member. My theory? It was Rome's paranoia wearing a different name. Because every time Rome saw a rising power, it reached for the knife. Zenobia could have broken. Most widows in that era were quietly shuffled into mourning gowns, politely erased from politics. But she didn't flinch. She didn't crumble. She didn't even blink. Instead, she made a move so bold, even her advisors probably thought she'd lost her mind. She took the throne. Officially, she declared her infant son, Vabalathus, the new ruler of Palmyra, because that was the proper thing to do. But everyone knew who was really in charge. The baby couldn't walk, much less negotiate trade treaties. So Zenobia crowned herself regent of the East. Translation: yes, I'm running this empire, and yes, you're going to deal with it. It was political chess played in sandals. Rome expected her to ask for help, maybe beg for guidance. Instead, she fortified borders, secured trade routes, and built an army that could make even Roman generals sweat through their armor. Palmyra became an empire in everything but name, disciplined, profitable, loyal. And when Rome finally noticed, they panicked. Because here was a woman ruling without permission. Not as someone's wife, not as a regent waiting for a man to grow up, but as a leader. A living contradiction to everything the empire stood for. The letters began. Polite at first. Diplomatic. You know, the kind of friendly reminder your landlord sends before the threats start. But Zenobia's responses were masterpieces of controlled shade. "Thank you for your concern, dear Emperor," she'd write. "But the East is doing quite well under our care." Translation: mind your own collapsing empire. Rome didn't laugh. Instead, they sent legions. Now, to put this in perspective, sending legions against Palmyra was like trying to evict a sandstorm. The Romans marched east expecting an easy victory. They'd fought Persians, Germans, and Gauls after all. How hard could a desert city be? Spoiler, very. Zenobia knew her terrain better than any Roman mapmaker ever could. She turned the desert into her weapon. The legions marched under a burning sun, their metal armor heating like ovens, their horses collapsing in the sand. And when they reached Palmyra's borders, exhausted, dehydrated, and overconfident, her cavalry appeared. Swift, silent, and merciless. The battle wasn't even close. By the time the survivors crawled back to their outposts, the message was clear. Palmyra wasn't Rome's puppet anymore. It was something new, independent, powerful, and terrifyingly competent. Let that sink in. A woman from the desert had just beaten the greatest army in the world. And yet, she didn't boast. She didn't write gloating letters or demand Rome's surrender. She just ruled, calmly, efficiently, like this was all part of the plan. Because maybe it was. This is where history gets interesting. Roman writers couldn't decide how to describe her. Some called her brilliant, others mad. Because when a man expands his empire, he's ambitious. But when a woman does it, she's dangerous. Convenient, isn't it? But Zenobia didn't care what they called her. She was too busy running a nation that actually worked. Trade flourished. Scholars came from across the known world to study in her city. Palmyra's art, architecture, and culture exploded, blending East and West into something the world had never seen. And somewhere, deep in the chaos of Rome, An emperor probably looked eastward and whispered the ancient equivalent of, "We have a problem, because this wasn't supposed to happen." Rome didn't lose to anyone, least of all a queen. And yet here she was, standing atop her palace steps, desert winds swirling around her, as merchants and soldiers knelt before her throne. The gold glinted off her armor, the same gold Rome once demanded as tribute. Maybe she smiled. Maybe she thought of Cleopatra, the queen who had once tried and failed to outplay the empire. Maybe she thought, let's see if I can finish what she started. So who was Zenobia? A scholar? A queen? A rebel? No, she was a mirror, reflecting back everything Rome feared it might become: old, weak, replaceable. The question now wasn't whether Zenobia would survive Rome's wrath. It was how far she'd go before history finally caught up to her. You have to hand it to Rome, they were terrible at losing. Whenever someone dared to defy them, they didn't take it as a challenge. They took it personally. And when the news arrived that a woman, yes, a woman from the desert, had beaten Roman legions and taken over their eastern provinces, the Senate probably choked on its grapes. Somewhere, an overpaid Roman historian immediately started sharpening his quill, ready to spin the narrative. She's not powerful, she's hysterical, because, of course. But here's the part they didn't want to write down. Zenobia didn't just win battles. She won hearts. She was more than a military genius. She was a brand, the kind of figurehead Rome had forgotten how to produce. She called herself Queen of Kings, which, by the way, wasn't a humble brag. It was a statement, a tagline that said, I run things now. And oh, she did. Within a few years, Zenobia's army marched across the Levant like sandstorms swallowing cities. She annexed Syria, captured parts of Turkey, and, in the move that made Rome spit out its wine, took Egypt. Let me pause on that. Egypt wasn't just any province. It was Rome's breadbasket, its source of grain, wealth, and ego. Taking Egypt from Rome was like stealing its wallet, lunch, and self-respect in one afternoon. The Roman governor of Egypt, a man named Tenagino Probus, decided to defend it. A brave move, short-lived though. Zenobia's forces crushed his troops, and Egypt became part of her growing empire. When Probus was captured, Zenobia allegedly sent him a letter that could have been framed as art. Your defeat was unfortunate, but necessary. Translation: no hard feelings. But also, don't try that again. The Desert Queen had done what no general, Roman or otherwise, had dared to attempt in centuries. She had built an empire that stretched from Anatolia to the Nile, a network of trade, culture, and diplomacy that rivaled Rome itself. But let's not pretend it was easy. Holding an empire together was like juggling flaming swords. One mistake and everything falls apart. Zenobia's strength wasn't just her ambition. It was her ability to balance chaos. She wasn't just a conqueror. She was an organizer. Roads were maintained. Markets stayed open. People prospered. Her administration was efficient, terrifyingly so, and that scared Rome more than any army ever could. Because here's the unspoken truth of empire. Power isn't just about conquest. It's about competence. And Rome had forgotten what that looked like. While Zenobia was out there modernizing trade and stabilizing her borders, Rome was on emperor number who knows what. Each one promised restoration. Each one lasted about as long as a bad haircut. Meanwhile, Palmyra, the desert city Rome used to dismiss as a trading post, had turned into a rival civilization. Imagine Apple watching a small startup suddenly release a better phone, faster network, and cooler logo, then realizing it's run by someone they fired centuries ago. That's how Rome felt. But Zenobia wasn't trying to replace Rome. At least not at first. She saw herself as an equal. Aurelian, the new emperor, could rule the West. She'd rule the East. Simple, balanced, efficient. Rome naturally didn't agree. Rome didn't do sharing. And yet, Zenobia's empire kept growing. Her portraits appeared on coins, half Greek goddess, half Middle Eastern monarch, a fusion of worlds. Her name was inscribed beside her son's, Vabalithus, symbolizing continuity. It wasn't rebellion. It was branding, smart branding, But power, no matter how polished, always casts a shadow. Rome began whispering rumors. The propaganda machine whirred to life like an ancient PR department scrambling for damage control. They painted her as arrogant, deceitful, too ambitious. Classic. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that men in power will call a woman ambitious the moment she stops asking for permission. Still, Zenobia didn't take the bait. She stayed calm, methodical. She made alliances. She strengthened defenses. She played the long game. And then something unexpected happened. Rome's own citizens started talking about her. Not as a villain, but as a visionary. Merchants returning from the east told stories of a queen who treated them fairly, who kept roads safe and markets thriving. Scholars admired her policies. Soldiers, even Roman ones, respected her discipline. She wasn't a barbarian queen in a dusty tent. She was a ruler of civilization. In some corners, she was admired more than Rome's own emperor. That's when you know you've made it, when your enemies start accidentally complimenting you. Still, Zenobia knew Rome's pride wouldn't let this slide forever. Every letter from the West carried the same unspoken threat. You've gone too far. But she also knew something Rome didn't. Time was on her side. The empire was too busy fighting itself to respond. The longer she held her ground, the more legitimate her power became. And for a while it worked. The Palmyrene Empire, yes, it even had a name now, became a hub of culture and learning. Artists thrived. Philosophers debated in marble courtyards. The desert bloomed with wealth and art. But let's zoom out for a second. Because in every empire story, there's a point when ambition crosses into danger. For Zenobia, that moment was Egypt. Taking it was bold. Keeping it impossible. Egypt was too important, too symbolic. Rome could lose Syria, could lose a few border towns. But Egypt, that was personal. The empire started to stir. Old generals came out of retirement. Gold was melted to fund new legions. The kind of quiet that falls before a storm began to stretch across the desert. Still, Zenobia didn't panic. She was confident, maybe too confident. But who could blame her? She'd done what no one thought possible. She'd built a stable empire from the ruins of another. And deep down, she probably believed that even if Rome came for her, they'd have to respect her. Spoiler: Rome doesn't respect anyone. When Emperor Aurelian finally rose to power, one of the few capable emperors Rome had left, the first name on his list wasn't a barbarian chief or rival general. It was hers, Zenobia, the Queen of the East. And yet, as Rome sharpened its swords and polished its armor, Palmyra didn't tremble. It shimmered. The desert queen sat on her throne, calm and regal, as messengers brought news of Rome's march. The winds howled across the sands, whispering of blood and vengeance. But Zenobia didn't flinch, because she knew something the Romans didn't. Empires fall not from invasion, but from exhaustion. And Rome? Rome was very, very tired. Would exhaustion be enough to save her? Or was this the moment the desert queen's golden light finally met the shadow of Rome's revenge? So here we are, the 3rd century version of the world's most awkward relationship. Rome, the self-proclaimed eternal empire, and Zenobia, the queen who just made them look like amateurs. And in this dysfunctional dynamic, one thing is clear. Rome can't stand that she's doing their job better. Now, most rulers in Zenobia's position would have played it safe. Sent tribute, flattered the Senate, pretended to be humble while quietly expanding. Not Zenobia. She didn't just rule. She rebranded the very idea of power. Picture this: new coins rolling out across the empire, stamped with her face right next to her son's. A subtle middle finger to Roman patriarchy. The message was clear. This isn't a placeholder queen. This is a dynasty. And for anyone slow enough to miss it, her wardrobe made the point crystal clear. Zenobia dressed like an empress, jewels, silk, the kind of gold you could see from space. But don't mistake it for vanity. It wasn't about looking rich. It was about looking legitimate. Image was everything in ancient politics, and Zenobia knew how to weaponize it. When she rode through Palmyra, crowds bowed not just to her title, but to her aura. The desert sun reflected off her armor like divine approval. Even the dust seemed to move out of her way. And, because she was nothing if not theatrical, she sent letters to Rome. Elegant, formal, and dripping with polite shade. "Greetings to our esteemed Emperor Aurelian," she wrote. "We trust the western provinces remain manageable. Translation: heard your empire's falling apart again. Thoughts and prayers." Rome didn't respond. Not publicly, anyway. Behind the marble walls, senators were probably screaming into their togas. Because here was this woman, this Eastern queen, not only surviving but thriving, commanding armies, and collecting taxes that used to belong to them. But the brilliance of Zenobia's rule wasn't just political sass. It was her ability to make people believe in her. Merchants called her fair. Scholars called her wise. Soldiers, the ones who actually bled for her, called her mother. She didn't rule through fear like most monarchs. She ruled through faith. She built schools and temples, funded philosophers, and turned Palmyra into a cultural lighthouse in a world collapsing into chaos. Under her leadership, the city glowed, literally. At night, oil lamps flickered through columns of white limestone, casting golden halos across courtyards. The streets hummed with voices, Greek, Arabic, Latin, all blending into the music of trade and empire. If you stood on a balcony in Palmyra at dusk, you could smell spice from India and hear gossip from Rome. Zenobia's empire was a living contradiction. A desert kingdom richer than marble Rome. A city of scholars ruled by a warrior queen. The Romans didn't understand it. They couldn't. To them, the East was supposed to be exotic, not organized. Beautiful but chaotic. And yet, there she was, outremaining Rome in every measurable way. Still, even legends have their cracks. Power is heavy, and Zenobia carried it alone. The advisors who once guided her husband were gone. Every decision, every victory, every punishment, every risk, now rested squarely on her shoulders. She ruled through intellect, but she knew intellect alone wouldn't protect her forever. Rome was quiet, and silence from an empire like that was never good news. She must have felt it, the tension in the air, like heat before a storm. The desert winds growing restless. The letters from Rome arriving slower. The merchants whispering that Aurelian, the new emperor, was different. That he wasn't another indecisive bureaucrat. He was a soldier, a hard one. But Zenobia refused to flinch. Instead, she doubled down. If Rome was going to come for her, she'd make sure they had to march through prosperity itself to get there. She commissioned new temples, honoring gods of every culture, a clever PR move for unity. She expanded Palmyra's defenses, trained her cavalry harder, and made sure her people had food, wealth, and loyalty. She knew a hungry army fights poorly, a hungry citizen revolts. And then came the rumors, not from Rome this time, but from within. Envious nobles, jealous generals, the kind of men who always show up when a woman succeeds, whispering about how unnatural it is for her to command. Some claimed she was too prideful, others that she was bewitched by Persian magicians, or even plotting to call herself Empress of Rome itself. Because, when a man expands an empire, he's ambitious. When a woman does it, she's possessed. But Zenobia was ahead of them. Every rumor was met with calm, calculated moves. A strategic marriage here, a diplomatic gesture there. She'd learned long ago that real power wasn't about shouting louder. It was about making everyone else whisper your name with equal parts awe and fear. Rome might have had armies, but Zenobia had something more dangerous. Narrative control. She decided who she was, and history would have to deal with it. Let's take a moment here, because in every era, there's someone like Zenobia, someone who refuses to play the role written for them. The world tells them to sit down, smile, and obey. And they look at the rules, look at the throne, and think, yeah, no thanks. But here's the tragic beauty of it. History loves to crown rebels but hates to let them rule. Rome could never let Zenobia's success stand, because her very existence proved that the empire's authority wasn't divine. It was just borrowed. Still, Zenobia held her ground. Her empire stretched further than ever. Her people adored her, and her legend was spreading faster than Rome's messengers could keep up. She must have known that confrontation was coming. the inevitable clash between the desert's rising sun and Rome's fading light. But even knowing that, she didn't step back. She stepped forward. Every act of defiance was wrapped in dignity. Every letter dripped with royal irony. Every victory reminded the world that greatness doesn't always wear a laurel crown. Sometimes it wears a veil and rides a camel. Rome, of course, saw arrogance. But what they called arrogance was confidence. Confidence built on competence. Confidence earned by survival. And as Rome's armies began to stir, legions tightening their ranks, banners raised in the west, Zenobia watched from her balcony, gold glinting in the twilight. Maybe she smiled. Maybe she whispered to the wind, "Let them come," because she knew something Rome didn't. You can chain a body, but you can't chain an idea. And Zenobia's idea of independence, brilliance, and balance in a world ruled by chaos was already unstoppable. There's a saying, history doesn't repeat, but it loves to plagiarize itself. And in Zenobia's case, it borrowed heavily from an older script. Because before there was Zenobia, there was Cleopatra, Egypt's last queen, Rome's favorite obsession, and history's favorite scapegoat. Now, Zenobia had grown up hearing the legends. Cleopatra, the woman who charmed Julius Caesar, melted Mark Antony's heart, and then watched her empire burn for it. To Rome, Cleopatra wasn't just a rival. She was a cautionary tale. "See what happens when women get ideas?" they'd whisper, while conveniently ignoring that male emperors were stabbing each other hourly. Zenobia studied that story like a textbook. She didn't roll her eyes at it. She dissected it. She learned where Cleopatra went wrong, and she swore she'd never make the same mistakes. No Roman lovers. No scandal. No dying dramatically in a pile of snakes. If she was going to stand against Rome, she'd do it with logic, not lipstick. But Cleopatra's ghost hung over her nonetheless. The two women were so often compared that even centuries later, historians couldn't separate them. The irony? They never met, yet their stories are woven like threads in the same tapestry. Two queens, two empires, and one unstoppable pattern. Rome's fear of female ambition. Zenobia leaned into the myth carefully. If Cleopatra was the seductress who lost to Rome, Zenobia would be the strategist who almost beat it. She even claimed descent from Cleopatra, not because she needed the clout, but because she knew exactly how to use it. "Oh, you remember her?" she might have said with a smirk. Well, I'm what happens when she learns from experience. She understood optics. The Romans loved drama, so she gave them drama on her terms. When she held court, she didn't whisper behind curtains or play coy with advisors. She stood tall, commanding, wrapped in gold and silk, the desert sun catching her every movement like she'd choreographed it. She looked like a goddess, spoke like a general, and ruled like a mathematician. Let's pause for a moment because it's easy to forget what this actually meant. This was the 3rd century. Women weren't supposed to rule empires, lead armies, or command respect beyond their living rooms. They were expected to inspire men, not replace them. But Zenobia didn't just replace them. She outperformed them. And that terrified Rome more than any invasion. See, for centuries, Rome's worst nightmare wasn't losing territory. It was losing control of the story. If Rome said a man was a traitor, he was a traitor. If Rome said a woman was dangerous, she was dangerous. But Zenobia refused to fit their narrative. She wasn't a seductress. She wasn't a witch. She wasn't even angry. She was efficient. And you can't smear efficiency. It's too rational, too real. That didn't stop them from trying. Roman historians, most of them bitter men with too much parchment and not enough therapy, painted her as a scheming temptress who forgot her place. Which is hilarious, considering she never had a place to begin with. She built her own throne out of desert stone and pure defiance. But for every slanderous scroll Rome sent westward, Zenobia sent armies eastward. Her empire stretched across borders that Rome once bragged about conquering. She was rewriting the geopolitical map with the precision of a cartographer and the confidence of someone who knew the gods were watching, and probably rooting for her. And here's the best part. She didn't even claim independence at first. She still sent letters to Rome with her son's name stamped beside the emperor's, as if to say, see, we're family, totally not plotting your downfall. It was political gaslighting at its finest. Rome, of course, saw right through it. But by the time they realized how far she'd gone, it was too late. Her soldiers adored her. Her subjects trusted her. Even her enemies respected her. But somewhere, under the golden facade of triumph, the ghost of Cleopatra still whispered. Because deep down, Zenobia must have known that Rome didn't let stories like hers end well. And yet, she pressed forward anyway. That's the thing about ambition. It's both armor and poison. Zenobia wasn't reckless. She was aware. She knew the odds. She'd studied how every powerful woman before her had been broken. By lies, by betrayal, by justice. And still she chose to rise. Imagine the weight of that choice. Every morning, stepping into her robes, hearing the whispers. Not just from Rome, but from her own court. Generals asking if war was worth it. Merchants worrying about trade routes. Advisors urging her to stay realistic. And Zenobia, calm as ever, replying, realistic is what keeps empires small. Because here's the truth. Zenobia wasn't just fighting Rome. She was fighting the very limits of what history allowed her to be. Cleopatra had tried to charm Rome. Zenobia would outthink it. Cleopatra had loved an emperor. Zenobia would rival one. Cleopatra had died for her pride. Zenobia would live for hers. But there's something beautifully tragic in that parallel, because no matter how different they were, both women faced the same enemy. An empire that couldn't handle being challenged by someone who didn't fit its definition of power. And maybe, just maybe, Zenobia saw it coming. Maybe on some quiet night, standing beneath the Palmyrene stars, she looked west and thought about Egypt. About a queen who'd faced the same winds, the same arrogance, the same empire. Maybe she whispered into the dark, I'll finish what you started. If Cleopatra's story was Rome's warning, Zenobia's was its reckoning. And yet, history always demands its payment. Because sooner or later, when you rise too high, Rome notices. And when Rome notices, Rome comes marching. Still, before that dust cloud appeared on the horizon, before the drums of Aurelian thundered across the desert, Zenobia's reign burned at its brightest. Her city gleamed. Her people thrived. Her legacy, though she didn't know it yet, had already carved itself into eternity. And as for Cleopatra's ghost, she could finally rest, because at last someone had done it right. By the year 272 CE, Rome had officially had enough. The empire had spent decades tripping over itself, losing emperors like socks in a dryer, but now it had something new. An emperor who actually worked. His name was Aurelian, and if you're imagining a stoic, scar-faced veteran who never smiled and probably yelled at clouds, you're not wrong. Aurelian was Rome's last great fixer. No parties, no poets, just war and black coffee. If coffee had existed, he would have invented it out of spite. So when reports arrived that Zenobia had basically turned half the Eastern Empire into her personal kingdom, Aurelian's jaw clenched so hard marble statues cracked in sympathy. He didn't send letters. He didn't threaten. He did what Romans did best when they ran out of patience. He marched. And this time, Rome wasn't stumbling in disarray. Aurelian had rebuilt the legions, drilled them to perfection, and reminded everyone what an actual army looked like. The man was a walking power surge, and his soldiers followed him with a kind of fanatical respect that bordered on religion. To them, he wasn't just a general, he was Rome resurrected. Zenobia, meanwhile, had seen this play before. Rome always talked tough, then got lost somewhere in the desert and died of sunburn. She had no reason to panic, at least not yet. Her generals assured her that Palmyra's cavalry could outmaneuver any legion. Her scouts said Aurelian's forces were far away. And Zenobia herself? Calm, composed, the kind of calm that makes even gods nervous. But here's the thing about Aurelian. He was terrifyingly efficient. He didn't just march, he sliced through terrain like a sword through parchment. His soldiers crossed mountains and rivers with mechanical precision, leaving behind nothing but dust and a few confused goats. Every fortress that tried to resist him fell. Every general who underestimated him vanished. And soon the message reached Zenobia: Aurelian is coming. Now, if this were a modern movie, this is where the slow-motion montage would kick in. Drums, the desert wind howling, Zenobia strapping on her gold armor, her soldiers rallying under banners shimmering in the heat. Because here's the part that makes her legendary. She didn't flee. She didn't send envoys begging for mercy. She gathered her troops, rode out in full regalia, and addressed them not as subjects but as equals. We fight, she told them, not for conquest, but for our right to exist. And that's not just rhetoric. Zenobia's war wasn't about greed or ego. It was survival, the East standing against centuries of Western arrogance. Her soldiers cheered. Merchants volunteered supplies. Even her scholars took up arms. But wars don't care about speeches. The first major clash came near Antioch, and it was brutal. Palmyra's cavalry, those sleek desert riders who could disappear into the dunes and reappear behind enemy lines, smashed into Aurelian's legions like thunder. The Romans reeled. For a moment, it looked like Zenobia's miracle might happen again. And then, Aurelian adapted. He'd studied her tactics. He'd watched how her cavalry moved. Fast, fluid, unpredictable. So he gave her exactly what she wanted. An open battlefield, endless space, and what looked like a retreat. Zenobia took the bait. Her riders chased the Romans, thinking victory was at hand, until the Roman lines suddenly reformed, encircling them like a steel trap. The desert that had always protected Palmyra became a coffin. Horses fell. Banners burned. The air thickened with dust and screams. Zenobia retreated to Emesa, modern-day Homs, to regroup. Her empire wasn't lost yet, but the tide was shifting. You could almost feel history holding its breath. Meanwhile, Aurelian didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He just marched on, methodical as fate itself. He was fighting not just an army, but an idea, and ideas don't die easily. Every city he captured, he spared civilians. Every enemy general who surrendered, he forgave. He was rewriting Rome's reputation one campaign at a time. The Eternal Empire had returned, and it wanted its pride back. But Zenobia wasn't done. She rallied what forces she could, pulled reinforcements from allies, and sent envoys east to Persia, begging for aid. If Rome conquers me, she warned, you're next. Persia hesitated. Empires always hesitate when they think the fire won't reach their door. In Palmyra, her palace still glittered, but tension crept through the halls. You can imagine her pacing at night, eyes fixed on the horizon. The same horizon that had once symbolized her freedom, now burning with Roman torches. Still, she refused despair. Even Aurelian's own records, written by men who had every reason to diminish her, admitted that Zenobia showed masculine courage. That's Roman historian speak for "we hate how impressive she is." And so, in the twilight of her empire, Zenobia did something almost no defeated ruler ever does. She stayed composed. Even as her armies weakened, even as the desert betrayed her, she carried herself with the same grace that had once made the world tremble. Let's take a breath here, because what's unfolding isn't just a war. It's the inevitable collision of two unstoppable forces. Rome, the decaying colossus rediscovering its power, and Zenobia, the radiant anomaly who dared to rewrite the rules. The tragedy isn't that one must fall. It's that both are too magnificent to coexist. When news reached Aurelian that Zenobia had retreated deeper east, he didn't pause to rest. He wanted her alive, a symbol, a trophy, maybe even proof that Rome still ruled destiny. But deep down, even he must have wondered, what if she's right? What if the world has moved on from marble halls and Latin decrees? What if power could come from the desert now? He didn't linger on it. Rome doesn't question itself. It conquers first and philosophizes later. And so, as Aurelian's legions pressed onward, banners snapping in the wind, Zenobia gathered what was left of her forces near Emesa. She still wore her golden armor, still rode her camel at the head of her troops. To the very end, she refused to hide behind walls or titles. In that moment, she wasn't just a queen. She was defiance personified. But the storm was coming. The Roman war machine, disciplined, relentless, terrifying, was closing in. And as the sun bled across the desert sky, even the sand seemed to know what was coming next. The Empire had struck back. Would Zenobia's light survive the darkness about to descend? History remembers battles as glorious things. Banners flying, heroes shouting, trumpets blaring. But that's the propaganda version. The truth is much uglier. A real battlefield is chaos. Dust choking your lungs, the metallic stench of blood mixing with sweat, and the sound of thousands of men discovering what fear actually feels like. That was a mesa. It was here, under a sun so hot it could have melted swords, that Zenobia's empire faced its reckoning. Her army, once the pride of the desert, stood between Aurelian's legions and Palmyra, their last stronghold. Behind them lay their families, their city, their queen. In front of them, the most disciplined killing machine the world had ever known. The Romans came prepared this time. They'd studied Palmyrene warfare, the swift cavalry charges, the ambushes in the dunes, the sudden vanishings into the horizon. Aurelian knew better than to fight her on her terms. He'd fight her his way, slowly, methodically, choking off her options like a snake wrapping around its prey. Zenobia, of course, wasn't stupid. She knew Rome had the advantage now. Her forces were brave, yes, but they were tired, stretched thin across months of battles and burned supplies. But retreat wasn't in her vocabulary. To yield meant to erase everything she'd built. And Zenobia didn't build things to see them destroyed. So she did what she always did, she adapted. She took what she had left, archers, camel cavalry, local allies, and shaped them into a final defense line around a mesa. The city's walls shimmered in the heat like glass, the desert wind carrying the faint smell of incense and iron. You can almost imagine the scene. Zenobia, standing tall on the ramparts, gold armor glinting in the sun, her expression unreadable. Around her, generals whispered advice, soldiers knelt for blessings, and priests chanted to gods who'd probably stopped answering prayers centuries ago. And then silence. Aurelian's army appeared on the horizon. Tens of thousands of soldiers, their shields flashing in waves of light, their banners rippling like living flame. The ground trembled beneath their march. Rome had come to reclaim its pride, and it wanted everyone to hear it. The first clash was deafening. Palmyrene cavalry thundered out of the gates. Fast, fearless, magnificent. They smashed into the Roman front lines with the force of a sandstorm, scattering infantry, tearing through formations. For a moment, just a moment, the Romans faltered. Dust and chaos swallowed the battlefield. The Desert Queen's army roared, believing, hoping, knowing they could win. But Aurelian was waiting for this. He signaled his reserves. From behind his lines, archers unleashed a wall of arrows that darkened the sky. Palmyra's cavalry, her proudest weapon, suddenly found itself trapped in a storm of iron. Horses screamed, riders fell. The desert wind carried cries of pain that echoed like ghosts across the sand. Still, Zenobia didn't retreat. She ordered her infantry to hold, archers to return fire, and her last reserve, elite guards sworn to protect her, to cover the flanks. Every order was precise, deliberate. This wasn't desperation. This was discipline. But discipline doesn't win against exhaustion. As the sun began to dip, the Palmyrene lines wavered. The Romans, steady as clockwork, advanced step by step, their shields locking like a moving wall. It was mechanical, merciless, the Empire's old rhythm rediscovered. By nightfall, Emesa was surrounded. Fires flickered across the horizon, the smell of oil and ash rising like a funeral hymn. Zenobia's generals begged her to retreat to Palmyra, regroup, rebuild. For the first time, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of fury. She'd come so far. She'd built something Rome couldn't destroy, and yet here they were, proving her wrong. Still, reason won. In the dead of night, Zenobia slipped away from Emesa with a small escort. Not to surrender, but to find help. She rode east, toward the Euphrates River, toward Persia. If she could reach the Persian king, she could regroup, raise another army, and make one last stand. It was a gamble, but Zenobia had made a career out of defying the odds. So she rode. Across endless dunes. Across the desert that had once been her ally. The gold of her armor dulled by dust. Her lips cracked, her eyes burning with fatigue, but her spine unbroken. Even in defeat, she carried herself like a queen. Behind her, Emesa burned. Palmyra's soldiers fought to the last man, buying her time. Some surrendered. Most didn't. The Romans took the city, but they couldn't capture her. Not yet. Aurelian, infuriated by her escape, sent his best scouts after her. They followed her trail through the dunes, over dry riverbeds, through the ruins of old trade routes. The chase became legend, one of the most desperate pursuits in ancient history. Days passed. The desert stretched endless, merciless. Her escorts began to fall behind, collapsing from heat and exhaustion. Zenobia pressed on, her camel trudging through sand that shimmered like molten gold. And then the Euphrates. Salvation. Persia just beyond the horizon. Except Rome was already there. Aurelian's cavalry had outmaneuvered her, cutting off the crossing. Surrounded, exhausted, her companions slain or scattered, Zenobia was captured. The queen who had defied the empire, who had built her own from sand and intellect, now stood before the Roman general who came to destroy her. And here's where history gets poetic, because even in chains, Zenobia didn't bow. Aurelian demanded to know why she had dared to challenge Rome. Her answer? Because I preferred to rule rather than serve. That line has echoed for centuries. Calm, proud, utterly unrepentant. You can almost see Aurelian's face. A mixture of fury and admiration. He'd finally met his equal, and he'd beaten her only by sheer force of empire. The war was over. Palmyra would fall. But Zenobia, the woman who had once made Rome tremble, had already secured something far more dangerous than land. A legend. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Hit that button, because what happens next is the most twisted PR spin in history. There's something disturbingly theatrical about Rome. Even in victory, it didn't just win, it performed. And no performance was grander, crueler, or more hypocritical than a Roman triumph. So picture this: the Eternal City, decked out like it's hosting the Super Bowl of arrogance. Marble streets lined with cheering crowds, banners flapping in the wind, musicians playing tunes that sound suspiciously smug. Incense clouds fill the air, mixing with sweat and wine and the unmistakable scent of victory, or vanity, depending on who you ask. And at the center of it all, in the chariot of gold and ivory, rides Emperor Aurelian, conqueror of the East, savior of Rome, fixer of problems he mostly caused by existing in the first place. Behind him, the spoils of war, exotic animals dragged in cages, jewels, gold, silks, everything looted from Palmyra, the glittering oasis now reduced to Rome's trophy cabinet. Statues of Eastern gods toppled and paraded through the streets, priests forced to chant hymns they didn't believe. And then the finale, the crown jewel of the parade, Zenobia. The crowd gasps as she appears, not as a ruler, not even as a prisoner, but as a prop. She's chained in gold, because of course she is. Rome has always been poetic in its cruelty. Iron chains would have made her look like a captive. Gold ones? That was the message. Even your dignity belongs to us now. But here's the twist: even in humiliation, she stole the show. Accounts differ, but everyone agrees on one thing. Zenobia walked. Head high, back straight, eyes unflinching. While Rome cheered its own triumph, it was her presence, not Aurelian's, that froze the city into silence. You could almost hear the unspoken thought ripple through the crowd. She doesn't look defeated. Aurelian must have hated that. He'd conquered kingdoms, marched across deserts, defeated the queen who defied Rome. And yet, standing in his victory parade, he was being upstaged by the very woman he'd chained. Because here's the thing about charisma: you can't conquer it. Rome thought it was putting Zenobia on display to show its power. Instead, it immortalized her. Let's pause there. Imagine the psychology of that moment. Zenobia, who once ruled cities that glittered under desert suns, now walking barefoot on Roman marble. Every step, a mockery of her former glory. And yet, she doesn't break. She doesn't beg. She doesn't cry. She just exists powerfully, defiantly. There's an eerie stillness in that image. It's as if history itself stopped to take a breath. Because it knew this wasn't just a queen in chains. This was a symbol. The empire could bind her wrists, but not her story. After the parade, Aurelian faced a dilemma. What do you do with a queen who's too famous to kill? If he executed her, she'd become a martyr. If he released her, she'd become a legend. Either way, she won. So he compromised. Depending on which source you believe, Zenobia was either imprisoned for life or granted a villa near Tivoli. Basically ancient Rome's version of being retired early with benefits. There, she lived out her days surrounded by luxury, raising her children, attending parties, and occasionally reminding guests that she once ruled an empire. And Rome, well, Rome told itself she'd repented, that she'd accepted defeat, that she'd learned her lesson, because empires love rewriting endings. It makes them feel safe. But let's be real, Zenobia didn't repent. She adapted. She'd survived assassins, sieges, and the world's largest military machine. Do you really think a fancy villa was going to break her spirit? No. She played the part Rome wanted to see, smiled when necessary, nodded at the right moments, and quietly outlived the men who tried to destroy her. In fact, some historians suggest that her family became integrated into Roman high society. Her daughters married nobles. Her descendants thrived. Imagine that the bloodline of Rome's greatest enemy mingling with its elite. The ultimate poetic justice. Meanwhile, Aurelian, the man who'd conquered her, didn't live to enjoy his triumph for long. Within a few years, he was assassinated by his own men. Rome, as always, devoured itself. Empires are like snakes. They're never sure where to bite until it's too late. Zenobia, on the other hand, faded into legend. Her name became a whisper on the wind, part cautionary tale, part inspiration. To Romans, she was the beautiful traitor. To Arabs, she was the noble queen. To history, she was proof that brilliance and defiance could bloom even in the harshest sands. Let that sink in. Rome paraded her as a captive to prove that rebellion was futile. And yet, 2,000 years later, we remember her name, not Aurelian's. Because humiliation doesn't last forever. But dignity, that's eternal. And maybe, in those quiet evenings in her villa, when the sun dipped below the Italian hills, Zenobia allowed herself a private smile. Maybe she thought of Palmyra, her city of marble and dust. Maybe she whispered the names of her people, her soldiers, her fallen friends. Maybe she laughed, softly, bitterly, at the irony of it all. Rome had won, but only in the way a thief wins after robbing a poet. You can steal the gold, sure, but you'll never own the words. That's Zenobia's legacy. Not her empire, not her defeat, her composure, the unshakable grace that turned her downfall into art. She was Rome's worst PR nightmare because she made losing look beautiful. And even as Rome's parades faded, its banners crumbled, and its statues eroded, her story refused to die. Because sometimes, immortality isn't about victory. It's about being unforgettable. And Zenobia? She's still walking, not through Rome's streets anymore, but through history itself. Head high, chains and all. History has a funny habit. When men fail, we call it a turning point. When women win, we call it a phase. And so, after Zenobia's fall, the world pretended she'd never existed. Rome erased her name from official records, literally scratched it off monuments, melted her coins, and accidentally lost scrolls about her reign. Typical empire move. When you can't beat someone's legacy, you just pretend it never happened. The city of Palmyra, once the shimmering crown of the desert, became a whisper, a place marked only on fading maps and half-forgotten trade routes. But the desert remembers. It always does. Centuries passed. Sand buried her streets. Wind carved her statues into faceless ghosts. Travelers stumbled upon the ruins and marveled at the scale. Grand colonnades, broken temples, walls that looked like they once touched the sun. They didn't know her name, but they could feel her presence. There's a certain energy that lingers where greatness once stood, call it spirit, call it stubbornness, call it Zenobia. Rome thought it had destroyed her story, but Rome, as it turned out, was terrible at predicting which stories survive. Because long after its emperors turned to dust, poets in Arabia began to sing of a queen from the sands, a woman who defied an empire and ruled with wisdom and fire. They didn't always call her Zenobia. Sometimes she was Zabaya, Al-Zaba, the desert lioness. Names blurred, details shifted, but the core remained. A woman who had dared to say no to the impossible. Let's pause here, imagine that. 1,000 years later, Bedouin storytellers around desert fires still reciting her legend, while the marble busts of Roman emperors crumble in their museums. That's poetic justice, the long game kind. But her legacy wasn't just cultural nostalgia. It was architectural defiance. Palmyra's ruins, her ruins, refused to vanish. Even centuries later, they stood tall enough to catch the dawn. The Temple of Bel, the Great Colonnade, the Triumphal Arch, they all whispered the same message. We were here. We mattered. Every empire that came afterward, Byzantines, Arabs, Ottomans, looked upon those ruins and felt the echo. Palmyra became a symbol, not of failure, but of endurance. The skeleton of a dream too bold to die quietly. And maybe that's why the ruins haunted people. Because deep down, we recognize ourselves in lost cities, beautiful things undone by ambition and time. Palmyra wasn't just Zenobia's capital. It was her mirror. Both had shimmered against impossible odds. Both had defied empires, and both ultimately had fallen but not disappeared. There's something deeply human about that, because we love stories of rise and fall. We need them. They remind us that power, no matter how dazzling, is temporary. But courage? That's eternal. Zenobia's courage didn't end with her capture. It lived in the stone and dust she left behind, in the way her story kept resurfacing like a ghost history couldn't exorcise. Every few centuries, someone rediscovered her. A scholar in Baghdad, a European explorer, an archaeologist brushing sand off a forgotten relief, and every time, they felt the same chill. Who was this woman? How did she make the desert sing? And that's the magic of forgotten queens. They're never truly forgotten, just waiting for the right century to wake them up. But let's not romanticize too much. Palmyra, after Zenobia, was never the same. Rome rebuilt it, of course, because Rome always rebuilds what it destroys, but it became a ghost of itself. The trade routes shifted, the wealth dried up, the desert reclaimed its kingdom. By the time medieval travelers arrived, they found silence. Columns without roofs, courtyards filled with sand, the sound of wind whistling through stone. Nature's way of saying, I'll take it from here. Yet even in that silence, something persisted. Every ruin told a story, of commerce, of conquest, of a queen who refused to die quietly. Fast forward to the modern age. Archaeologists arrive with cameras and notebooks, brushing dust off inscriptions that once bore her name. The world gasps at the beauty of Palmyra, the artistry, the precision, the sheer audacity of building something so magnificent in the middle of nowhere. And once again, her ghost rises. Documentaries, books, poems. Everyone trying to reconstruct the woman Rome erased. Everyone trying to understand how, in an age of emperors, she managed to become something more dangerous than any of them, memorable. But here's the part that hits hardest. Palmyra's ruins didn't just survive time. They survived war. For nearly 2,000 years, they stood through invasions, earthquakes, even modern artillery. Until one day, in our own century, they faced the same kind of cruelty Zenobia once fought, blind destruction. Extremists stormed her city, blew up temples, crushed statues, tried to erase history again. And yet, even then, people wept not because stones were lost, but because something sacred had been attacked. Something eternal. Zenobia's spirit. The idea that beauty, knowledge, and defiance can exist even in desolation. The irony couldn't be clearer. 2,000 years ago, an empire destroyed her city to prove dominance. 2,000 years later, another tried and failed to erase her again. And still, Palmyra endures. Tourists return. Scholars rebuild. Artists paint her story. Because some ruins aren't meant to be mourned. They're meant to remind us. Zenobia wasn't forgotten. She was waiting for a world ready to understand that her defiance wasn't arrogance. It was prophecy. Because if there's one thing the sands of Syria whisper when the wind passes through Palmyra's pillars, it's this: empires fall, queens rise, and legends never die. Let that sink in. There's a rule every historian quietly learns. If you lose, you don't get to write your own story. Someone else does, usually your enemy. And if your enemy happens to be Rome, well, good luck. They'll give you a villain arc even if you were the second coming of Mother Teresa. That's exactly what happened to Zenobia. When the dust settled and the empire stopped congratulating itself, Rome began its favorite pastime: revision. They couldn't just let a woman who almost beat them remain noble in memory. Oh no, they had to fix the narrative. Suddenly, scrolls started circulating. Zenobia, the treacherous queen. Zenobia, the arrogant upstart. Zenobia, who dared to dream above her station. You can almost see the quills shaking with pettiness. Roman historians described her as beautiful but dangerous, intelligent but too ambitious. Translation: we're still mad she made us look dumb. And you know what's wild? They couldn't even insult her properly. Their hatred came out sounding like admiration. One wrote, "She possessed a man's courage and a woman's grace," which is Roman for, "We hate that she's better than us in every possible way." But that's what Rome did best: gaslight the future. They'd twist facts into morality tales and call it history. Their propaganda machine was so effective that it turned their enemies into caricatures and their failures into teachable moments. They couldn't admit that Zenobia was competent, visionary, and probably the only person in the 3rd century keeping the East from collapsing entirely. Because if they did, the illusion of Rome's perfection, the marble facade they'd built around their insecurity, would crack. So they turned her into an example. "See," they said, "this is what happens when people, especially women, forget their place." But history, inconveniently, has a sense of humor. Because every century after, someone would stumble on the ruins of Palmyra, read those same Roman accounts and think, "Wait, this doesn't sound like a villain. It's almost poetic." The more Rome tried to bury her, the louder she echoed. And here's the thing about history written by the victors. It's never really written for the victors. It's written for their descendants, to make them feel better about their ancestors' mistakes. Rome didn't document Zenobia's story to tell the truth. They documented it to justify their guilt. Imagine the Roman senators reviewing those reports. "Yes, yes, very good. Make sure to emphasize her arrogance. Don't mention that we starved half of Syria. And definitely don't say she ran a functioning economy." But cracks always appear. You can't erase competence. The evidence lingers. Coins with her image, fragments of letters that show her wit, temples and trade routes that prove her leadership wasn't fantasy, it was infrastructure. And slowly, scholars began to see through Rome's performance. They realized Zenobia wasn't the cautionary tale. She was the mirror. Rome didn't destroy her because she failed. They destroyed her because she succeeded too well. Think about it. She governed a multi-ethnic empire, balanced trade across continents, maintained peace among wildly different religions, all without collapsing under her own ambition. Compare that to Rome, which was assassinating its emperors faster than it could carve their busts. But let's be honest, this pattern isn't unique to ancient times. Even now, power still writes its own bedtime stories. Losers get edited out. Rebels get recast as lunatics. Visionaries get labeled unstable, because it's easier to mock a threat than to understand it. Zenobia was Rome's mirror, and Rome couldn't stand its reflection. The irony, though, their smear campaign didn't work. Oh, it worked for a while, sure. Her name faded from textbooks. Her legacy got buried under centuries of dust. But legends are patient things. They wait until the victors start crumbling, and then they whisper back. And that whisper sounds something like this: "You needed me to be your villain so you could feel like heroes." Let that sink in. Because Rome's biggest lie wasn't that Zenobia was a traitor. It was that Rome itself was invincible. Eternal, they called it. Eternal, like the Colosseum's bloodstains. Eternal, like the tax records they falsified. Eternal, like the hypocrisy that rotted them from the inside out. By the time Rome fell, slowly, painfully, like an old god wheezing out its last prayer, the world remembered Zenobia again. And the best part? It remembered her differently. No longer the rebel, now the visionary. The one who saw a version of civilization that Rome couldn't imagine or refused to. She wasn't trying to destroy the empire. She was trying to update it. In her vision, East and West weren't enemies. They were partners. Trade over war, culture over conquest, philosophy over propaganda. But try pitching that idea to an empire that thinks peace is just the time between invasions. So Rome called her dangerous. And yet, centuries later, guess whose ideals shaped the modern Middle East? Whose concept of trade routes, cultural exchange, and religious tolerance resurfaced long after her death. Spoiler, not Aurelian's. It's almost funny. The empire that paraded her in chains couldn't chain her ideas. Because you can forge steel. You can silence voices. You can burn scrolls. But you can't kill truth, you can only delay it. And Zenobia's truth, that a woman could rule with brilliance, that an empire could be built on intellect instead of brutality, was too big to stay buried. Rome gave us statues. Zenobia gave us stories. And while statues crumble, stories migrate. Across centuries, across tongues, across generations. So yes, history may be written by the victors, but it's rewritten by those they tried to erase. And somewhere, in the ruins of Palmyra, under that endless blue sky, the wind still carries her verdict, gentle but unyielding. You wrote your lies in marble. I wrote mine in sand. Let's see which lasts longer. The funny thing about history is that we keep pretending it's over. That all those ancient stories, the power struggles, the betrayals, the delusional emperors, are relics of a less civilized past. But if Zenobia could peek through the centuries and scroll through modern news headlines, she'd probably smirk and say, "Oh, you're still doing this?" Because nothing really changes. The names get fancier, the costumes get cleaner, but the pattern stays the same.
Ego builds empires.
Arrogance breaks them. And somewhere in between, there's always someone, usually underestimated, trying to fix the mess before it collapses. Zenobia was that person. The reformer, the strategist, the inconvenient genius who tried to stabilize a world that was spinning itself apart. And if you squint just a little, you'll see her reflection in every modern story of power. Think about it. The CEOs who build billion-dollar empires and start believing their own press releases. The politicians who mistake popularity for permanence. The influencers who think legacy means trending twice in 1 week. Rome had emperors who called themselves gods. We have billionaires who buy social networks. Same energy, different fonts. And Zenobia's story, her rise, her brilliance, her defiance, exposes a truth that every age tries to ignore. Power is not a prize. It's a test. Rome failed it spectacularly. Zenobia, for all her ambition, almost passed. Her empire wasn't built on conquest alone. It was built on trade, culture, education, things Rome considered boring because they couldn't parade them through the streets. But Zenobia understood that real strength doesn't come from fear. It comes from competence, from balance, from giving your people something worth defending. She didn't want to burn Rome. She wanted to build something better, and that's exactly why Rome couldn't let her live. Empires don't hate rebels. They hate replacements. And that's where the modern parallels sting a little. Because we've all seen this movie before. The visionary who builds something beautiful, challenges the system, rises too fast, and then gets crushed by the machinery of power. Sometimes it's a corporation swallowing a startup. Sometimes it's a movement silenced by bureaucracy. Sometimes it's just public opinion turning on someone who dared to outshine the establishment. Zenobia's story feels timeless because the psychology of power hasn't evolved. The faces have changed, the tools have changed, but the egos? Identical. Aurelian wanted control. Rome needed to prove it was still the center of the world. Zenobia wanted autonomy, not to destroy the empire, but to make it sane. And in the collision between those two visions, We see the eternal human flaw, the refusal to share power, even when sharing it could save everything. Sound familiar? Maybe that's why her legend still resonates. Because every era has its Rome, the bloated institution convinced it's eternal. And every era has its Zenobia, the brilliant outsider who dares to say, "You're not." Let's take a moment to breathe that in. Because we tend to read stories like hers as ancient tragedies, as if all that blood and brilliance happened in another universe. But look closer. The same forces that brought Rome down, pride, greed, denial, overreach, are alive and thriving. Zenobia's rise is what happens when vision meets opportunity. Her fall? When vision meets ego. But what if the fall wasn't failure? What if it was prophecy? Because here's the thing about Zenobia. She didn't just challenge Rome's politics. She challenged its psychology. She proved that empires are only as strong as their ability to adapt. And the moment they refuse to change, they start digging their own graves. Rome, of course, didn't get the memo. It learned nothing from its victories. Within a century, the empire that once laughed at Zenobia was overrun, divided, and begging barbarian kings for mercy. Meanwhile, the East, the lands she once ruled, continued to thrive under new civilizations inspired by the same trade and culture systems she'd built. In other words, she lost the war, but she won the century. And that's the lesson most people miss. The real revolutionaries don't always get the parades. They get the consequences. But the world they leave behind ends up quietly following their blueprint. Look around. The idea that East and West can coexist, that knowledge and commerce can bridge continents, that women can rule without apology, that's Zenobia's ghost whispering through every era. Even now, her story feels dangerous because it's so familiar. When a woman dares to lead without permission, we still call her too ambitious. When a small nation dares to prosper without bowing to a superpower, we still call it defiant. When intelligence threatens brute force, we still act like it's rebellion. The 21st century may have Wi-Fi and democracy, but our instincts, pure Rome. And maybe that's why Zenobia's memory keeps resurfacing. Because she represents the question humanity still hasn't answered. Can power exist without domination? Rome's answer was no. Zenobia's answer was yes. And if we're honest, brutally honest, we're still deciding who was right. So what do we do with her story now? Do we file it under ancient history, nod politely, and move on? Or do we treat it like what it really is, a mirror? Because when we look at Zenobia, we're not just seeing a woman who defied an empire. We're seeing ourselves, the dreamers who build, the systems that resist, and the inevitable cracks that follow when ambition meets arrogance. Zenobia's rise shows us what humanity can be. Her fall reminds us what we usually choose instead. And if we're still repeating that pattern 2,000 years later, maybe the empire that truly never fell is human ego itself. You can't chain a story like that. There's something almost cruel about time. It eats empires like a slow animal, patiently, quietly, one grain of sand at a time. But every now and then, time chokes on something. A name, a story, a queen who refuses to disappear. Zenobia was one of those rare things that time couldn't digest. Centuries after her fall, the world moved on, or pretended to. New empires rose, new gods demanded worship, and Rome's marble pride eventually cracked into rubble. But somewhere in the Syrian desert, her city, Palmyra, stood stubbornly against oblivion. It didn't just crumble. It waited. The ruins became her monument. Long after the empire that destroyed her turned to dust, Palmyra's columns still caught the sunrise like a cathedral of ghosts. Travelers from distant lands stumbled upon it and couldn't believe their eyes. Massive archways, temple walls, and avenues that once shimmered with silk and gold. All still there, like a fossilized dream. It didn't look like defeat. It looked like defiance frozen in stone. But here's the haunting beauty of it. Palmyra wasn't just a relic. It was a pulse. Even as the centuries dragged on, the city seemed alive, whispering through cracks and carvings, telling anyone who'd listen that greatness doesn't always need to survive intact to be remembered. And then came the modern age, cameras, archaeology, the rediscovery of history's forgotten queens. The world fell in love with Zenobia all over again. Artists painted her as a desert goddess. Poets called her the mirror of Cleopatra. Historians called her the last light before the Middle Ages. And tourists flocked to Palmyra, walking through the same streets where Zenobia once planned empires, breathing in air heavy with ghosts and sunlight. But let's not romanticize it too soon, because legacy, like empire, is fragile. In 2015, the world watched in horror as modern war reached Palmyra again. Extremists swept through the ruins, detonating explosives in temples that had stood for 2 millennia. They destroyed statues, smashed columns, tried to erase what they didn't understand. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like Zenobia's city was finally gone. But you can't bomb memory. Archaeologists risked their lives to save fragments. Historians documented every stone. Artists around the world rebuilt Palmyra digitally, pixel by pixel. The world grieved, yes, but it also resisted. Because in that moment, everyone realized that Palmyra wasn't just a Syrian city. It was human history, a shared story of beauty, loss, and endurance. Zenobia would have understood that perfectly. She built her empire in a world addicted to destruction, and somehow, through sheer intelligence and stubbornness, she made something that outlasted it. Her temples turned to ruins, her statues shattered, but her idea survived. The idea that culture can outlive conquest, that knowledge is a better weapon than the sword, that empires fall but civilization, real civilization, rebuilds. And that's the part of Zenobia's story that modern history rarely mentions. She wasn't just a conqueror, she was a curator of humanity. Under her reign, Palmyra was a place where Greek philosophers debated beside Arab poets, where Roman engineers traded ideas with Persian scholars. She built bridges before anyone thought of the word globalization. It's easy to forget that, especially when we reduce her to the queen who defied Rome. That's a catchy headline, sure. But Zenobia's real defiance wasn't against an empire. It was against oblivion, against ignorance, against the arrogance of those who think power is the same thing as permanence. And even now, in a world that prides itself on progress, that same arrogance lingers. We still destroy faster than we create. We still forget faster than we learn. But Palmyra's ruins remind us that art and memory can be rebellion. That rebuilding, not revenge, is the final act of defiance. Let that sink in. Because when archaeologists pieced together shattered stones from Zenobia's temples, when digital artists recreated her city in virtual reality, they weren't just restoring monuments. They were continuing her mission, to keep knowledge alive. To remind us that history isn't something buried in museums. It's breathing. It's evolving. It's us. So when we look at those half-broken columns standing under the Syrian sun, we're not just seeing ruins. We're seeing her heartbeat, and it's still strong. Palmyra endures because Zenobia's story endures, not through propaganda or power, but through the simple miracle of remembrance. Every time someone whispers her name, every time her image appears in a book or film or lecture, she wins again. Because silence was Rome's weapon, and survival, quiet, graceful, unyielding survival, is hers. That's the paradox of history. Dust always wins, but some dust glitters. And Zenobia's does, because legacy isn't about immortality. It's about resonance, the echo that refuses to fade. And her echo reaches farther than she could have dreamed. Across time, across continents, across the fragile line between history and myth, she built an empire that died. But she also built a story that never will. And if you listen closely, really listen, you can still hear her voice in the wind that passes through Palmyra's ruins. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It simply reminds. Empires burn. Memory rebuilds. Because dust, when touched by purpose, becomes legacy. Let's be honest, nobody in history ever lost gracefully. Not kings, not generals, not even the guy who invented Betamax. Losing is ugly, sweaty, and loud. It smells like ego and ash. But Zenobia? She did something almost impossible. She made losing look like art. Because here's the thing about empire. It's never about survival. It's about image. Rome could collapse in debt, drown in its own corruption, assassinate 3 emperors before lunch. But as long as the marble was polished, the empire was eternal. That's the real Roman religion. Denial. Zenobia never had that luxury. Her empire fell in daylight on open sand, in front of the whole world. And yet, somehow her defeat feels poetic, controlled, even deliberate in a way, like she understood something everyone else didn't, that dignity lasts longer than victory. It's almost cinematic when you think about it. The moment of capture, the golden chains, the crowd screaming insults. Any other ruler would have collapsed under that weight. Zenobia didn't. She didn't curse, she didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She just was. It takes a terrifying amount of self-awareness to know when you've lost, and even more to decide how to lose. Rome expected a tantrum. What they got was composure, and that's what made her unforgettable. The empire marched her through its streets to humiliate her, and somehow, she turned the parade into a coronation. People weren't staring at a broken queen. They were staring at defiance wearing a crown of calm. Now that's power. But here's the irony, Rome thought it had ended her story. Instead, it ended its own mystique. Because the moment Zenobia appeared in chains and still looked royal, something shifted. The myth of Rome's invincibility cracked. If a desert queen could walk through their capital and steal their spotlight, maybe Rome wasn't divine after all. Zenobia didn't win the war, but she stole the narrative. And that's the art of losing gracefully. It's not pretending you didn't lose. It's controlling what your loss means. Rome wanted her fall to symbolize rebellion punished. Instead, it symbolized courage silenced. It's like when your favorite movie villain gets the best lines and you secretly root for them, even when they lose. That's Zenobia. She didn't need to win. She just needed to exist loudly enough that history couldn't forget her. And let's face it, we're still talking about her, not Aurelian. But losing gracefully isn't just about optics. It's about acceptance, not the surrender kind, but the clarity kind. Zenobia knew she couldn't outfight Rome forever. But she also knew that what she'd built, her ideas, her legacy, didn't need swords to survive. Empires fade. Ideals migrate. That's the quiet revenge of history.
Rome crumbled.
Zenobia endured. Her city may have fallen, but the way she fell, the composure, the poise, the eerie lack of desperation, became a masterclass in legacy management. She was, in modern terms, the original unbothered icon. And here's a question worth asking. Can you ever really lose if the world remembers you for how you lost? Because winning gives you headlines. Losing with grace gives you immortality. It's funny, every era produces its Zenobias. People who stand up, get crushed, and somehow become larger than life because of it. Think Joan of Arc, Galileo, Rosa Parks, different stories, same pattern. People who lost battles but rewrote the definition of victory. Zenobia belongs to that club. The defeated but remembered elite. The ones who understood that power isn't about surviving the fight. It's about what survives after you're gone. And let's not sugarcoat it. She was human. She probably wept. She probably raged in private. Maybe she cursed the gods, or wondered if it had all been worth it. But she never let the world see it. She guarded her image like a queen guards her crown, and that's what made her myth bulletproof. That's what Rome never understood. They could conquer her body, but not her reputation. Because humiliation only works when the victim agrees to feel humiliated. Zenobia refused. Imagine that. Your enemies chaining you up, parading you through their streets, and you walking as if it's your coronation day. That's not delusion. That's strategy. She was writing her own ending while Rome thought it was writing hers. And centuries later, that's why her story still resonates. Not as tragedy, but as transformation. She didn't lose. She converted her loss into legend. There's a strange kind of beauty in that, the quiet, defiant beauty of someone who understands that everything ends, so you might as well make the ending yours. Even now, when her ruins shimmer under the desert sun, you can almost feel it, that sense of stillness, of completion. The knowledge that she lost everything and somehow gained forever. So maybe losing gracefully isn't about letting go. Maybe it's about holding on to your dignity, your truth, your version of the story. Rome fell drunk on its own ego. Zenobia fell in full awareness, eyes open, spine straight. And if you've ever faced something that tried to break you, a system, a failure, a betrayal, you know how much strength that takes. That's the real art she mastered. Because the world doesn't remember who wins every war. It remembers who deserved to. And when the dust finally settles, when the ruins are all that's left, people don't whisper the name of the empire. They whisper the name of the queen who stood against it. Zenobia didn't lose beautifully by accident. She did it on purpose. She made her fall unforgettable, and in doing so, she made sure Rome's victory wasn't. History has a wicked sense of humor. The same empire that tried to erase Zenobia ended up turning her into art. You can't make this up. The golden chains Rome used to humiliate her became her signature accessory in paintings centuries later. Poets, sculptors, and historians couldn't stop romanticizing the image of the queen in chains. Rome meant it as punishment. The world turned it into poetry. That's the thing about symbolism. Once you release it, you don't control it anymore. And Rome, bless its marble heart, had no idea what it had unleashed. Let's rewind to that infamous parade for a second. The moment Aurelian dragged Zenobia through the streets of Rome, something cracked. Not in her, but in the empire's narrative. Rome wanted to show dominance, but all anyone saw was fear disguised as celebration. You don't throw that big a parade for a nobody. You only make that kind of noise when you're scared the story won't stick. And it didn't, because the image of Zenobia in gold chains, upright, proud, unbroken, outlived every emperor who mocked her. Fast forward 1,000 years, and she's a muse. Painters in Renaissance Italy depict her as a tragic goddess, a noble prisoner, a symbol of virtue chained by arrogance. Voltaire name-drops her. Italian operas romanticize her. Even the Victorians, a society built on polite hypocrisy, adored her as the woman who defied the empire and stayed elegant doing it. See the irony? Rome used her to prove that rebellion fails. History used her to prove that rebellion matters. It's poetic justice in its purest form. The shackles Rome crafted to break her became the halo that immortalized her. Every artist who painted her, every writer who resurrected her, unknowingly added another link to the chain. Not of imprisonment, but of remembrance. And it's not just art. Her story became a cultural Rorschach test. Everyone who rediscovered Zenobia projected their own struggles onto her. Feminists saw her as the first icon of resistance. Revolutionaries saw her as proof that the oppressed could rise. Scholars saw her as a bridge between East and West, a queen who understood both sides before they even knew they were sides. She became a universal metaphor, adaptable, enduring, and deliciously inconvenient. Rome tried to define her. The future refused to cooperate. And honestly, that's what terrifies every empire, every tyrant, every system built on control. The idea that you can win every battle and still lose the narrative. Zenobia's story is living proof. You can destroy a city, melt the coins, rewrite the chronicles, but you can't stop the whispers. You can't stop the art. Because art, like defiance, is contagious. And Zenobia's defiance didn't fade. It evolved. In medieval Arabic chronicles, she became Alzaba, the warrior queen who outwitted kings. In Europe, she was Zenobia of Palmyra, the tragic beauty who stood tall against Rome. In the 18th century, she became a symbol of Enlightenment ideals, proof that intellect and liberty could coexist. In the 20th, she became a feminist icon before feminism had branding. Now, she's a meme, a digital icon, a woman from 1,700 years ago trending on the same platforms that idolize Kardashians and conspiracy theories. If that isn't victory, what is? The irony is intoxicating. Rome conquered the world but couldn't conquer her image. And maybe that's the ultimate revenge, immortality by misunderstanding. Rome wanted her remembered as a warning. We remember her as a wonder. Let that sink in, because that's how history corrects itself. Slowly, subversively, through art, through story, through irony so thick it could cut marble. It's almost funny when you think about it. Rome had its statues, its columns, its eternal monuments, all now chipped, faded, and fenced off by gift shops. Zenobia? She lives rent-free in our imagination. Every time someone stands up to power, her ghost is there. Every time a woman refuses to apologize for her ambition, her legend sharpens. Every time an empire overreaches, her story whispers. Remember how this ends. And that's what makes her timeless. She's not just a historical figure anymore. She's an archetype, the rebel queen, the fallen visionary, the inconvenient truth. The golden chains? They've become the metaphor of a lifetime, because everyone wears them. We all carry something that was meant to break us, expectations, fear, guilt, power structures. But the art of survival is turning those chains into jewelry. Zenobia did it first. She wore her failure like it was fashion. She made empire look outdated. She turned defeat into iconography. That's not luck. That's awareness. That's strategy. And maybe, just maybe, that's why she still feels so modern. Because she understood something we're only starting to admit. Losing control of the narrative doesn't mean losing the legacy. Rome thought they were writing her ending. Turns out they were just outlining her mythology. So here's the grand irony. In case you missed it, Rome built arches to glorify conquest. Zenobia became the arch itself, connecting centuries, bridging worlds, curving beautifully between power and grace. Her story didn't need marble. It needed memory. And memory, once it chooses you, never lets go. So yeah, Rome won the war. But Zenobia won history's sense of humor. And that's a prize no empire ever gets to keep. If you ever find yourself standing in the Syrian desert, where the horizon melts into heat, haze, and silence hums louder than sound, you'll feel it. That quiet defiance in the air, that pulse beneath your feet. The desert doesn't forget. It hides, it waits, but it remembers. Palmyra may be ruins now, but ruins have a strange kind of power. They don't beg for attention, they command it. The sun hits those ancient stones just right, and suddenly you're not in 2025 anymore. You're in her world. You can almost hear the echo of hooves against marble, the hum of merchants bartering in a dozen languages, the faint laugh of a queen who once thought she could outthink eternity. And maybe she did, because the desert still speaks, not with words, but with wind. The same wind that once carried her banners now brushes over the broken columns of her city, whispering stories that history tried to silence. You stand there and it's eerie. The emptiness isn't empty. It's charged, like the world itself is holding its breath, still deciding whether Zenobia lost or just paused. That's the thing about the Middle East. Empires come and go, but the land doesn't care. It watches, quietly amused, as conquerors bleed and crumble on its sand. The Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, the colonizers, all of them promised permanence. All of them vanished. But Palmyra? Palmyra still stands. Broken, yes. Scarred, definitely. But breathing. That's Zenobia's real victory. She didn't build a city that could withstand armies. She built one that could withstand time. And time is the cruelest empire of them all. You can still see her fingerprints there, in the layout of the streets, the blend of architecture, the inscriptions that weave Greek with Arabic and Latin, as if languages themselves were shaking hands. Palmyra was her dream made solid. A fusion, not a conquest. A crossroads, not a throne. And even now, centuries later, it still looks like an argument she started with history and never finished. There's a kind of serenity to it. The city's bones are white as moonlight, smooth as the memory of greatness. Birds nest in the cracks of her temples. The call to prayer echoes across what used to be her palace walls. The modern world hums faintly in the distance, a reminder that civilization moved on, but her story hasn't. You know what's strange? Every civilization that stumbled across Palmyra's ruins has called it something different. Some saw it as a warning, others as inspiration. But they all felt the same chill, the sense that they were walking through the aftermath of something divine. Because it's not just architecture, it's presence. It's the way the stones still stand in perfect symmetry, like soldiers waiting for her to return. The way the wind carves lines through the sand, like an invisible script retelling her legend every night. The way the stars seem to gather over the ruins, as if guarding her memory. Zenobia may have been dragged to Rome in chains, but her soul stayed here, among the dunes, among the broken arches, in the silence that hums louder than applause. And here's the real paradox: the desert should have swallowed Palmyra whole. By all logic, it should be gone. But it's not. Every empire that touched it fell, but somehow the ruins persisted. That's not survival. That's resistance. Maybe that's what she wanted all along. Not immortality in statues or scrolls, but this: a city that refuses to die. A legend that keeps whispering centuries after the empire that tried to silence it has turned to dust. Stand there long enough and you'll start to feel small. Not insignificant, just humbled. You realize how absurdly temporary everything is. Every war, every leader, every empire convinced it's the last. The desert has seen it all before. It'll see it all again. And in that stillness, you begin to understand Zenobia in a way no history book ever could. She wasn't chasing glory. She was chasing meaning. The kind that doesn't fade when the applause stops. The kind that can't be paraded in chains or rewritten by men with pens and agendas. She wanted her world, the East, to matter, to be more than a footnote in someone else's empire. And against all odds, she made it so. Now, whenever archaeologists uncover a piece of Palmyra, they're not just dusting off stone. They're uncovering defiance. Proof that even when history buries you, it never buries you deep enough. Because the desert doesn't just remember Zenobia, it protects her. Every gust of wind, every grain of sand, carries fragments of her story. The kind of immortality you can't build. The kind you have to earn. And maybe that's the lesson she left behind. That strength isn't about permanence. It's about persistence. About staying loud in a world that wants silence. About standing even when you've been broken. The desert still speaks. And if you listen closely, it doesn't tell you a story about power or conquest. It tells you something simpler, softer, and infinitely harder to forget. It says, she's still here. Every empire has that one thing it just doesn't get. For Rome, that thing was why anyone would dare to exist outside of Rome. They genuinely couldn't comprehend it. To them, the world was divided into two categories: those who were Roman and those who were wrong. So when Zenobia rose from the dust and built something that looked suspiciously like Rome, but smarter, fairer, and with better architecture, it short-circuited their worldview. How dare a desert queen succeed without their permission? How dare she build culture without their blessing? It wasn't just rebellion. It was blasphemy against their worldview. See, Rome's entire identity hinged on the illusion of control. They believed they owned civilization itself, that roads, laws, and glory flowed from them like divine gifts. But Zenobia didn't worship that illusion. She reimagined it. While Rome flexed its legions, Zenobia built trade. While Rome taxed its citizens into starvation, Zenobia invested in them. While Rome burned through emperors like kindling, Zenobia built an administration that actually functioned. She was, in short, what Rome could have been if it had therapy. But Rome didn't want therapy. Rome wanted worship. And that's what it never understood, that power and respect aren't the same thing. You can command obedience with a sword, but you can only earn loyalty with fairness. Rome had forgotten that. Zenobia remembered it. And that's why her people followed her into impossible wars, not out of fear, but out of faith. When Aurelian dragged her through the streets of Rome in chains, it wasn't just her defeat they were celebrating. It was their own denial, the collective, insecure relief of a civilization that had almost been outclassed by a woman from the desert. They cheered because they needed to believe she was gone. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, is that her kind of power doesn't end in chains. It multiplies. Rome's legacy was concrete and conquest. Zenobia's was culture and connection.
Romès lasted centurie.
Zenobia's outlasted meaning, because culture never dies. It adapts, and that's the part history rarely mentions. The ideas Zenobia stood for, equality in leadership, coexistence between East and West, intellect as strength, didn't vanish when her empire fell. They spread like light through cracks in stone. They showed up in later civilizations, in philosophies, in stories about fairness and empathy that Rome's marble couldn't contain. It's almost ironic, the very thing Rome mocked her for became the foundation of what we now call civilization. Rome built walls. Zenobia built bridges. And bridges, inconveniently, last longer. Let's put this in perspective. Rome believed its dominance came from divine favor, that it was chosen by the gods. Zenobia believed in reason, in learning, in the audacity of self-definition. To Rome, she was dangerous because she thought differently. She didn't want to destroy them. She wanted to evolve them. But that's the tragedy of progress. It always looks like heresy to those in charge. Sound familiar? Every empire since political, corporate, digital makes the same mistake. They think rebellion is their downfall. But rebellion is their mirror. It's the moment someone points out the cracks in the marble and says, "You've mistaken fear for structure." Rome didn't hate Zenobia because she was cruel. It hated her because she made them look outdated. And nothing ages faster than arrogance. Even Aurelian, Rome's savior, probably knew it. He might have chained her body, but her intellect haunted him. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world and realizing your greatest victory was over someone who ruled with more grace, intelligence, and efficiency than you ever could. That's not triumph. That's insecurity dressed as ceremony. And centuries later, when historians look back, that's what they see. Not a rebel queen crushed by empire, but an empire undone by its own insecurity. Rome never understood that empires aren't maintained by fear. They're maintained by imagination. And Zenobia had more imagination than all of Rome's Senate combined. Because imagination builds futures. Empires only build monuments. Zenobia imagined a world where East and West could coexist. Where knowledge wasn't hoarded but shared. Where strength wasn't cruelty but balance. It wasn't naive. It was revolutionary. And revolutions rarely survive their creators. But ideas don't need to survive to succeed. They just need to exist long enough to be remembered. That's what Rome couldn't grasp. Thought erasure was victory. But erasure only works if no one is looking. And the world, despite its chaos, its wars, its forgetfulness, kept looking. Every explorer who stood in Palmyra's ruins, every poet who wrote about her, every historian who whispered her name into a classroom full of half-interested students. Each one was another rebellion, another small defiance against Rome's attempt to silence her. And somewhere, in whatever afterlife queens get, Zenobia is smiling at the irony. Because Rome, for all its power, has become a museum exhibit. Its emperors are trivia questions. Its gods are cosplay. Its empire, the so-called Eternal Empire, is a postcard collection. But Zenobia, she's still relevant. She's the cautionary tale and the comeback story. The question and the answer. The what if and the still might. That's what Rome couldn't understand. You can bury a body. You can silence a voice. You can rewrite a book. But you can't stop the right idea at the wrong time from becoming immortal. Zenobia's name may have been written in sand. But the desert, unlike marble, never lies, keeps its promises. It holds its memories. And long after Rome crumbled into legend, the wind still carried her truth. Quiet, steady, impossible to kill. Rome wanted her forgotten. The desert made her eternal. Every story ends in dust. The question is what shines through it. Rome ended in dust. Palmyra ended in dust. Even Zenobia herself, the woman who dared to stare down the biggest empire in history, eventually became part of that same eternal sand. But not all dust is equal. Some dust remembers. Some dust glitters. And Zenobia's, it still sparkles under the desert sun. Let's rewind for a moment. Picture it. Centuries have passed. The marble of Rome lies cracked. The emperors who once strutted through their triumphs are now statues missing noses in museums. Their gods, abandoned. Their laws, forgotten. Their legacy, a tourist attraction with a gift shop. And yet, halfway across the old empire, in the heart of the desert, the ruins of Palmyra glow in the twilight. Tourists still wander through her colonnades. Archaeologists still brush away sand from her temples. And scholars still whisper her name as if she might answer. That's the thing about immortality. It's never about living forever. It's about being impossible to erase. Zenobia achieved that. Not with armies. Not with power. With audacity. the audacity to imagine herself equal to the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the audacity to rule with intellect instead of cruelty, the audacity to lose publicly, spectacularly, and still come out as the one we remember. It's poetic, really. Rome had 1,000 emperors, and yet when we talk about their golden age, her name always sneaks into the conversation, like a ghost in their marble halls, reminding everyone who the real legend was. Because power fades, gold rusts, statues crumble, but stories have better survival instincts. Zenobia's story has been retold for nearly 2,000 years, translated, twisted, romanticized, politicized, and through it all, she's never stopped evolving. To one generation, she's a rebel queen. To another, a feminist icon. To another, a symbol of Middle Eastern pride. Every era reshapes her in its own image, but the core remains the same. The woman who looked at empire and said, "No," and here's the beautiful irony. She didn't just defy Rome. She outlasted it. Rome called itself eternal. But if you look around today, the eternal empire is gone. Palmyra's ruins, though battered and scarred, still stand. And Zenobia's name, still spoken, still studied, still sung, might be the truest definition of eternity we have left. Let that sink in. Because immortality isn't marble. It isn't thrones or coins or titles. It's resonance. That echo that keeps bouncing through time long after the voice itself is gone. Zenobia's echo is everywhere. In every woman who refuses to be silenced. In every small nation that refuses to bow. In every artist who rebuilds what war tried to destroy. It's there in the dust that coats Palmyra's stones. In the wind that sighs through broken archways. In the silence that hums louder than Rome's parades ever did. That's the secret she left behind, that the most powerful thing a person can build isn't an empire. It's an idea, and her idea was simple. Strength without cruelty, culture without conquest, pride without permission. Rome could never understand that. The world still struggles to, but Zenobia lived it. She proved that rebellion doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like poise, like intellect, like a queen refusing to bow even when her wrists are chained in gold. And maybe that's why her story endures, because it's not just history, it's prophecy. A reminder that everything built on arrogance will eventually fall, and everything built on courage will eventually rise again. Empires come and go, algorithms change, borders shift, but defiance, graceful, intelligent, unyielding defiance, that's forever. You can almost imagine her ghost standing there now, at the edge of her ruined city, watching the horizon turn red with another sunset. The same horizon where Rome once marched, where wars raged, where civilizations rose and fell like waves. She's watching, silent, proud. The world keeps spinning, and she keeps being. Because immortality isn't about being remembered. It's about being inevitable. And Zenobia has become inevitable. Even her dust refuses to settle. It dances, restless, golden, eternal, across the ruins of her city, across the pages of history, across the imagination of every person who hears her name and feels that little spark of rebellion stir inside. Zenobia lived. She ruled. She lost. And she became legend. So the next time someone tells you history is boring, tell them about her. Tell them about the queen who rode into war on a camel, who outwitted generals, who stared down Rome and didn't blink. Tell them how her city still stands, how her story still burns, how her name still hums in the wind. Tell them that dust, in the right light, looks a lot like gold. And tell them that immortality, true immortality, belongs not to those who conquer the world, but to those who dare to change it. Because Zenobia did, and the desert still sings her name. Let's step back for a second. Take a deep breath. Because after all the war, all the sand, all the ego, all the noise, there's silence again. The kind of silence that feels earned. The kind of silence that belongs only to the ruins of something extraordinary. Palmyra's columns still glow gold at sunset. The same light touches Rome's broken arches, Constantinople's domes, and the scattered bones of every empire that swore it would last forever. And somewhere in that endless silence, You can almost hear her, Zenobia, still standing, still proud, still whispering, "You can bury a body, not a story." That's the secret Rome never figured out. Empires die when people stop believing in them. But legends, real legends, live when people keep feeling them. Zenobia wasn't just a queen. She was the embodiment of that feeling, of courage dressed as elegance, rebellion wrapped in restraint. She didn't need a crown. She wore conviction. She didn't need a throne. She built one out of memory. And here's the punchline, we're still talking about her. 2,000 years later, across languages, across cultures, across screens and microphones. She survived everything. Conquest, propaganda, sandstorms, and Wi-Fi. Because her story taps into something universal. The defiant heartbeat that refuses to fade, even when everything else turns to dust. Think about it. Rome had armies. Zenobia had belief. Rome had marble. She had meaning. Rome built roads to move soldiers. She built routes to move ideas. She wasn't trying to conquer the world. She was trying to connect it. That's why her story still works in every era. Every time humanity divides itself, by empire, by race, by wealth, by faith, Zenobia's ghost rises from the desert and reminds us that true power isn't domination. It's imagination, the ability to see something bigger than your own reflection. And maybe that's why she hits so hard in the modern world. Because today our empires don't wear togas. They wear suits. They have logos, algorithms, followers, and yet the pattern's the same. Arrogance, expansion, collapse, repeat. We've replaced marble with glass, Caesars with CEOs, legions with comment sections. But the psychology? Identical. Rome thought it was eternal. So do we. And Zenobia, if she were here right now, would probably laugh. She'd see our skyscrapers and our satellites and say, "Cute, but where's your soul?" That's what she understood. That greatness isn't about scale, it's about substance. Empires rot when they lose their purpose. People endure when they find one. And she found hers. Zenobia's power wasn't her army, her intellect, or even her rebellion. It was her refusal to be small in a world that told her to be silent. Her decision to keep standing tall, even in defeat, is what made her immortal. That's the difference between power and legacy. Power fades the second the applause stops. Legacy whispers for eternity, and hers is still whispering. In every woman who leads without permission. In every artist who builds beauty out of ruin. In every person who chooses dignity over domination. Zenobia isn't a ghost. She's a blueprint. Let that sink in. Because that's the kind of immortality you can't fake. You can't buy. You can't conquer. You have to earn it with truth, with courage, with the guts to stand up to whatever Rome looks like in your lifetime. And here's the real twist. Rome never beat her. It only delayed her. Because today we live in the world she imagined. A connected world, a global world, where ideas cross borders faster than armies ever could. That was her vision, and she built the first version of it from sand. The Romans mocked her for dreaming too big. But who's laughing now? Her city might be ruins, but her dream won. Because it's still alive in trade routes, in scholarship, in the way we even think about the Middle East today. Zenobia's rebellion didn't end in defeat. It evolved into influence. And that, right there, is how legends cheat death. Because immortality doesn't come from living forever. It comes from changing what forever means. She did it without dragons, without destiny, without divine intervention. Just intelligence, conviction, and a stubborn refusal to kneel. That's what makes her story so intoxicating. She's not fantasy. She's proof. Proof that you can lose everything and still win history. Proof that you can be forgotten by textbooks and still remembered by time. Proof that even when the empire thinks it's written the final chapter, you can still steal the last word. And that word, the one that echoes louder than all of Rome's marble, is still. Still standing. Still remembered. Still shining. Still her. So the next time someone says history is boring, show them this. Show them a woman who almost broke Rome with brilliance. A queen whose ruins hum louder than empires. A story that refused to die. empires fall, queens rise. If the story made you feel something, that spark of awe, that little heartbeat of rebellion, then don't let it fade. Share it. Keep it alive. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're inheritance. They remind us who we were, who we are, and who we could still become. So subscribe, follow, or whatever your version of defiance looks like. Because every week, we dig up another buried truth that history tried to silence. Stay curious, stay awake, and remember, the only thing more dangerous than power is a woman who knows she has it. Fade out. The desert wind hums. A final shot of Palmyra's ruins at sunset. Gold, dust, eternity.